So yeah, are science comics worth 1,000 words? That's the question at the heart of my project, and also, I guess, the question for you listening to this brief talk today. We don't have much time, but I want to start, I want to say a bit more about my background, because I think it explains how I ended up working on this unusual project. Then I'm going to talk more about my research, and also try to see how it fits in this interdisciplinary landscape. So, as Pamela mentioned, I have a pretty traditional science background. I studied biology and then specialized in computational neuroscience, University College London. But I always had this parallel interest in comics. I always been reading comics, like most of us, I guess, as children, but I kept reading them. I also like to draw, so I slowly started drawing my own comics and developed this parallel career as a cartoonist illustrator. But for many years, I kept these two things very separate. I wasn't actively trying to hide my passion for comics from my scientist colleagues, but I didn't really see any overlap there, since science and comics kind of are at the opposite poles of our cultural scale. Like science is considered something very high, something very serious, and comics are pretty much the stereotypical lowbrow, medium, by many people still considered pretty much cheap entertainment for kids. So it was okay with me. I just did my science during the day and then went home and drew my comics during the evenings or weekends. Until toward the end of my PhD, I met my friend Hannah. I mean, she joined our lab as a postdoc in neuroscience, but she also was doing some science communication. And she was really the first one from the scientific community to get excited about my side activity in comics, and she really encouraged me to use comics to communicate science. And at the beginning, I have to say I was very skeptic. Science communication is not something I was really actively planning to do. But the more I talked to her, the more I actually realized that because of the stereotype of comics as something very easy, very approachable, it could actually be a good way to reach a whole new audience, which we don't necessarily reach with our academic papers or talks like this one. So what started as a sort of joke between two friends quickly grew into a longer project, a graphic novel, which we published in 2013 with the support of the Wellcome Trust. And back then I would never dream to talk about this in my academic talks, but even in a neuroscience department like this, you're much more likely to have seen neurocomic than my academic papers, because yeah, the truth is that as soon as it was published, neurocomic took off and was very successful. It sold thousands of copies, got translated in more than 5 languages. So this kind of hijacked my career for a while. After my PhD, I started drawing comics and illustrations full time. And I quickly realized I wasn't the first nor the last one. Especially in recent years, there is this growing tradition of educational comics, science comics. First in this more traditional graphic novel format, mostly biographies of scientists. But then more recently, I started to see comics also on academic journals. 2015, both Science and Nature published short comics. And also from the other side, from the comic communities, there is a growing interest. The Comics Grid, which is one of the most respected comic scholarship journals, just announced an open call for a special collection on graphic science. Just 2 weeks ago, this Journal of Sketching Science was announced. It's not really clear what it is. And especially online, I started to see more and more of these comics, animations, and what I broadly define as graphic narratives about science. So this was all very exciting for me. I started to pay attention to this, but the scientist in me wasn't completely satisfied. I really wanted to know if this was just a trend, just a new form of entertainment, or if there is something specific about visual narratives that can make them a tool for science communication alongside more traditional mediums like writing, video, audio. And so, yeah, in short, I wanted some research. I wanted to know who is the audience for this visual narratives, what are the effects on perception of science, science engagement, and if there is any effect, ideally I would like to know what are the underlying cognitive mechanisms, because I would like to start used in a more informed way. And this, in a nutshell, is really the project I proposed to PSSN in 2016. And I started, as I guess any scientist would start, looking for empirical studies, for data about science comics or educational comics, more in general. And maybe not surprisingly, there isn't very much. I literally found only a handful of them, mostly done in the classroom, some of them out of the classroom, more specific about science communication. And as you can see from this table, they're all over the place in terms of target audience, subject. So I wouldn't really draw any general conclusions from these studies. But so far, what they suggested, the comics are not necessarily better than textbooks or text in general in terms of learning, but they may improve student engagement, readers' engagement, and their interest in the subject. And these effects are more pronounced for students with less science background. And this is why I think really the best application for comics may be not in the classroom, but outside with the general public. However, all the studies have some major limitations. First of all, most of the authors of the studies are also authors with comics. Essentially, they are mostly science teachers or science writers that draw the comic, give it to their students, and then ask them if they like it or not. And this, of course, poses all kinds of problems in terms of biases. And also, I have to say that scientists don't always make the best cartoonists, present company excluded, of course. So yeah, I think we could do better than that. And also, more fundamentally, textbooks and comics are not really comparable because, as I'm going to say in a moment, comics often employ characters and narratives, humor, that are all things that we know affect learning and perception of science. So I think we're comparing apples and oranges here. So as some of the authors acknowledged as well, the effect of comics in the classroom may be not really due to the comic as a format, but to other factors. So yeah, what I want to see is better design studies. And that's what I started to do, essentially replicate these findings outside of the lab. With my two mentors, with the help of my mentors, I wrote a short comic. First, I wrote a text article about the research of Kimberly Nobles here at Columbia on the effect of early childhood poverty on brain development, which is something that's getting a lot of attention, so something that's part of the general science communication landscape. And so, yeah, I wrote this comic, and then we started recruiting participants online, and what we do is essentially give them either the comic or the text version, and then ask them questions aimed to estimate things like knowledge, engagement, and aptitude towards science, although it's not easy. And then we also give them a second article. In this way, each participant reads both a comic and a text article. And also, we do this because, as I mentioned, I don't want the result to be relying only on my comic. So I want to be as general as possible. So this was the first attempt. I literally ran the first trial in January. Unfortunately, so far, I don't see any strong results, I have to say. Comics and text are pretty much equivalent on knowledge and engagement. But maybe I'm not asking the right question because it's not all negative. For example, when I asked them explicitly which of the previous formats do you think was more effective, so which one of which article, most of them choose the comics, even if I don't see any effect that this has in benefit. But yeah, this is just the beginning. I think there is much more to do with this data. I want to look, for example, for specific subpopulations, because it's possible that even if on average they're the same, comics may be more beneficial for, again, for example, people with lower science background. I definitely want to test other subjects, because we started with these two subjects, which are different, but still always about medical research, which in a way is the easier thing to communicate. And I would like to see how comics do with more abstract topics that go beyond the human scale experience, and also look for maybe longer term effects. But beyond the empirical studies themselves, I really started to see, I started with these few empirical studies on comics, but I quickly realized that what I was looking at is more like an intersection of much broader areas of research. And so I really became interested in all this field, which I never really, I didn't know much about before. And I started to essentially compare and draw connection and really try to map out all the things that could have an effect, could be part of the effect of comics. And I think really, like, that's how I really see a large part of my project right now, trying to draw, to map out this connection. Because of course there are people already working within each of these fields, but sometimes difficult to know how they come together, how they're connected. And so yeah, I feel like maybe my role could be more of a signpost to just help people in one field to, for example, people writing comics to know about all this research on narratives and metaphors. And I want to try to touch briefly on all these three in this last 5 minutes. So first of all, visualization. Of course, there's a huge field of research. There have been a lot of studies that show that all these marks and symbols that we use in diagrams, in scientific visualization, do have an effect on learning. And this is something that is not usually associated with comics. Comics are usually analyzed in, maybe in comparison to film or writing. But if we look at the more, at least the more experimental kind of comics, like this one by Chris Ware, I think comics really have a lot in common with this, with all this tradition, and can really build and expand upon this. So I think it would be interesting to look at comics under this perspective. And on this front, I started collaborating with a group of international experts in science visualization, and we started looking at comic patterns applied to, for example, infographics, but data visualization in general. And we have a paper on this we're going to present at CHI in a few months. The second big area is narrative research, narrative communication. Again, huge field of research in psychology. I became particularly interested in this research that shows how narratives can be powerful tools of persuasion. And of course, they don't, unlike other tools of persuasion, other methods like cognitive elaboration, they don't rely on logic, on arguments, but they engage the reader on a more emotional level. They rely on things like transportation and identification with fictional characters. And I think this is relevant for comics, because comics not only are very good at storytelling, but they are especially good at creating this relatable character. Scott McCloud, one of the leading comic scholars, pointed out how some of the most popular comic characters are essentially emoticons. They are extremely simplified, and this may allow a broader readership to follow these stories. And this can be really useful in science, of course. And in fact, I noticed that a lot of science comics, including my own, end up with the same narrative device of having this fictional character to guide the reader in these topics, in this field where we don't really have a clear human angle. Of course, the last, this, as you can see also from these comics, the third and one of the most interesting for me lens I'm looking comics at is the field of metaphors. Again, huge field in linguistics and cognitive psychology. Metaphors have been recognized as a cognitive tool. In particular, I think for us is relevant the research of Deidre Gentner, which we had the pleasure of having at one of our recent seminars. And she really pioneered the study of metaphors and analogy in science education. And she kind of showed how this metaphoric language we use, this mapping from one concept to another, is really useful when we have to approach new fields, new concepts in science by relating them to more familiar fields. And this is similar to some concepts that also have been studied in science journalism and science communication about the effect of framing and the use of metaphoric language and how this affects public perception of science. And again, to bring it back to comics, I think is important because comics have been often described as an intrinsic metaphorical medium. Everything in a comic, starting from the speech bubble, is really meant to be read as a symbol for a real world entity. So even the most realistic comics, I think they are really suited to large extent visual metaphors. And once again, we can see some examples from science comics that use these characters, these metaphors, to make abstract and familiar concepts more relatable through everyday experiences, everyday situations. So that this was all super rushed. If you want to know more about any of this, I just published this review on the Journal of Science Communication, where I go into much more detail. And just to conclude in the last minute, I really want to stress the fact that this is an emerging field. And so something I started doing beyond the empirical studies is try to keep track of any science, comic, animation, narrative that comes out, and collect them online on this website, cartoonscience.org. Just because I realize that there are more and more scholars looking into this, but we all come from completely different backgrounds, and often it's difficult to know what's going on and what has been done in other fields. And yeah, this for me was kind of the most surprising and rewarding aspect of my project. Through this website and my review, I started to get in touch with, for example, medical illustrators that would like to use comics, but it's not really part of their curricula, or science teachers that want to introduce comics in the classroom, but they don't know where to find science comics. So I think a big part of what I'm trying to do is create a community and bring people together around this topic. So yeah, with that I conclude. Thank you for your attention. If you want to know more, these are my contacts. And yeah, looking forward to my mentors.